Thank you very much indeed. And it's my honor and privilege to speak here for the second time. I had the privilege to speak here as well last year. And I want to thank all my dear Israeli friends for inviting me here again. I want to particularly thank Professor Reichman, and we heard his very eloquent geopolitical survey, and my good friend Professor Boaz Ganor, who we had the privilege, in fact, to host at the United Nations just a couple of weeks ago. And we heard a very insightful presentation by him on what he called the art of terrorism, which I suppose draws from the philosophy of the art of war by Sun Tzu. Let me say, first of all, that having heard my dear and distinguished friend and colleague, SRSG Mladenov, that as the United Nations, as he said, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who had just been in this region, is forging a new vision for the United Nations. And we start from a position of humility. We come here to this major international conference and in many other places in the spirit of trying to listen and understand, because nobody has the monopoly of truth when it comes to dealing with this very multifaceted and complex challenges in this modern society that terrorism poses. We know that terrorism has been an age-old evil. It's not something new. But the dangers that terrorism poses and violent extremism pose is a danger to all of us. Today, we meet on 9/11, 16 years after that catastrophic attack. And so much has happened. So many thousands of people have died. So many billions of dollars have been spent. So many military interventions have occurred. And nobody has been spared as a victim. In this country, across the world, in my part of the world, in the Arab and Muslim world. I come from Pakistan. My own uncle was killed. He was the governor of Northwest Frontier by the Taliban. And as we heard others in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, this is also the Islamic world. So we should be very careful, and we should understand that terrorism has no religion, no culture, no ethnicity. And we have to understand, and as I said, in a spirit of humility, to begin to speak to each other, to see what it is that we can come together to do about terrorism. And this is the spirit in which the Secretary General Antonio Guterres has made the reform of the counterterrorism architecture of the United Nations as his very first priority. And it is my pleasure and honor to represent this new Office of Counterterrorism that he has established, and I will speak more about it. The theme of my statement today is how do we move from the rhetoric to the reality of counterterrorism cooperation. Since 9/11 and even before that, there have been countless international conferences such as this. You are meeting here for the 16th time. We have had numerous resolutions, numerous meetings in the Security Council and other forums. We have built a whole international legislative framework and national legislative framework. In this country, we just heard Minister Shakit, whom I had the privilege to meet last year. You have adopted a new law. A lot is being done. But if we look at the state of the world today, 16 years afterwards, let us be frank. Are we winning the war against terrorism, or are we simply winning a few battles and cheering each other whilst the war moves on? I think that we need to take a step back and ask ourselves some hard questions. After so many resources, so much political capital, so much talk, the terrorists are not deterred. They move on to the next frontier. 5 years ago, when we were meeting, we would have been talking about the global threat of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Today, in the past 5 years, we have been talking about the caliphate and the threat of ISIS and Abu Bakr Baghdadi. And now we are celebrating the fall of Raqqa and Mosul as if we have won the war. Well, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, we have not won the war, as depressing as it sounds, because the terrorists have moved on. They have moved on physically and they have moved on virtually. Physically as far away as southern Philippines, before Mosul and Raqqa even fell. Moving on to Africa and other new frontiers, soft underbellies, finding new physical space, but now finding new virtual space too, because we know that the greatest challenge is not just in terms of radicalization through the internet, it is the use of the internet. Cyber terrorism that poses the greatest danger, so that some kid in Latin America could pose a danger to infrastructure in Southeast Asia and vice versa. The point here is not to be alarmist or dramatic, but it is that we must wake up. We should not wake up to another terrorist attack like 9/11 and say what happened. And so we need to build a new vision in regard to multilateral cooperation. Because if we are honest with ourselves, no one country, no matter how powerful, can fight this multifaceted danger of terrorism. Why? Because terrorism is becoming transnational. As we deal with the problem of lone wolves at home, at the local level, we also see that the transnational linkages are growing. When you have foreign terrorist fighters from over 100 countries, that means that this insidious disease has penetrated the minds of so many young people across so many continents, and it has really truly become global. In fact, the fact that ISIS could recruit nationals of over 100 countries, it is becoming a sort of United Nations of terror. And so the terrorists have recognized the value of multilateral cooperation. Have we? Or do we pay lip service to the rhetoric of multilateral cooperation? If we look at the way in which member states and governments cooperate with each other, I would say to you that it is long on hope and short on practice. Even some of the closest countries, the closest allies, do not share information and actionable intelligence. And we know that terrorism moves at lightning speed. While we recover from the last attack, terrorists are planning for the next attack. And so the question here is, do we have a vision? Do we know where we're going? Do we know where we will be in 5 years? What kind of terrorism are we going to be confronting? As we heard from my distinguished colleague, Ambassador Mladinov, we see now an increasing vicious vortex between protracted conflicts, the exploitation of those protracted conflicts at the local level by transnational terrorist groups, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda before it, and as a result of that, the proliferation of violent extremist ideologies that feed off those protracted conflicts and transnational terrorist groups, which in turn feeds back into those protracted conflicts. And we have foreign fighters coming from far who have no interest in the local resolution of those disputes, as we saw in Syria and Iraq recently. So we cannot silo counterterrorism as if it is a specialized science or a specialized art, as Professor Ganon would say. And I agree with him, it is an art. But the point is that how is it connected to the international geopolitical reality? And that is why Secretary General Antonio Guterres has recognized at the very beginning of his term the importance of mainstreaming the work of the United Nations into not only the prevention fold, but bringing counterterrorism into the heart of the work of the United Nations. And there are 5 very specific actions in that context as we build a new vision of multilateral cooperation, moving from rhetoric to reality. The first is that we need, as I said, in a spirit of humility, try to learn some of the lessons of what we have been trying to achieve. Not just the positive lessons, but I would submit to you the negative lessons, where we have failed or are failing. And pursue more evidence-based counterterrorism policies. Policies that are based on empirical evidence, not on ideology, not on demonizing the other, not on the rhetoric of counterterrorism, but on the facts. And we all know, and we are surrounded here, and I'm humbled to see so many counterterrorism officials working on these issues. It's not as if we don't know. We know that the International Center in Herzliya is a leader in this, in terms of its research, in terms of its writing, in terms of its thinking, and so many other centers around the world. Are we applying that research and knowledge to the development of our counterterrorism policies? I think that a lot more can be done on that, and we all know that. Let me just cite two very modest studies, underline the word modest studies, that the United Nations itself has done. I know that there are skeptics in this room of the United Nations, and I'll come back to that. Two very recent studies. My own UN Counterterrorism Center commissioned two very distinguished international counterterrorism experts. I'm sure many of you know my good friend Richard Barrett and Professor Hamid Al-Said from the United Kingdom, to look at the motivations of foreign terrorist fighters. Why do young people gravitate and run to ISIS, leave their homes, their comfort zones, and run to ISIS in Syria and elsewhere? A big question in all of our minds. Some of them come from very educated, well-established backgrounds, and many come from very underprivileged. And so we wrote to all governments, and this is what I mean by the deficit of international cooperation. We wrote, as the United Nations Counterterrorism Center, asking for access, asking to be able to interview, get into the minds of these people who have returned, to understand what motivated them to go, what they did there, and why did they come back. Because the issue of return is a big issue. Their families, their children. It's a big issue. And we need to understand what is going on in the minds of these individuals. Sadly, only about 5 or 6 countries allowed us to have access. We had a very small sample of 12 nationalities, but even that very modest sample told us a lot. And what did it tell us? Well, what I'm going to tell you is not going to be a big surprise, but it confirmed that deprivation, marginalization, economic factors are a big factor. And it is not just ideology, it's the desire to defend their co-religionists that is more of a factor than just religion or ideology itself. A second study by the United Nations Development Program, one of the 38 entities that my office coordinates, 38 UN entities, the United Nations Development Program just last week launched a major study where they interviewed some 718 individuals in Africa, in Somalia, in Sudan, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Niger, in Kenya, across East and West Africa, where, again, try to understand not why these people were running to Syria to join ISIS, but what are the factors locally that is making them attracted to violent extremism. And interestingly, that study not only confirmed our other earlier study about the role of economic factors and marginalization and deprivation, but it also pointed to the fact, and this is something very fundamental and not going to be popular, speaking from the United Nations, that government actions, the actions of governments, are a trigger. How governments respond, how individuals have perceived the actions of government, whether in terms of the use of force, the violations of human rights, or the interference with their families and their communities, that becomes a trigger in itself. And what does that mean then? That means that we have to pursue more intelligent policies. We need to develop more comprehensive policies. We need to break down the silos between government and between governments across the world. We need to forge a better consensus, and we need to think about action and reaction. So, in that context, going from the evidence-based approach, as I said, these are two very modest studies, and I'm sure many of you have a lot of other empirical data looking at the push and pull factors. We need to bring that to the fore in regard to forging better government policies. The second aspect of this, when we talk about developing better policies, is to put a new focus on prevention. Well, we all know prevention. All of you are practitioners of that. We know that for every terrorist attack, there are 100 other that have been prevented, and very little credit is given that. That's about operational prevention. What I'm talking about is structural prevention. And here, when you talk about structural prevention, we're talking about addressing the very drivers of violent extremism. If we're going to pursue evidence-based approaches, then we have to have a better understanding of what are the push and pull factors and what kinds of structural prevention policies do we pursue. And when we talk about structural prevention, it means that we have to build better policies of good governance, human rights, respect for human rights, and inclusive policies, as my good friend Ambassador Maladinov just pointed out, and political solutions to long protracted conflicts, to remove the oxygen in which terrorists breathe and are proliferating. And so that is why the United Nations put forward a major plan, an international plan, to build multilateral cooperation to prevent violent extremism, a PVE plan of action. And we are now busy working with national governments and regional organizations to develop national and regional PVE plans of action. There are now 77 countries that are doing this with the support of the United Nations. And the point here is that it's not the international community that's going to solve the problem of violent extremism. It is actually the national governments themselves that we have to support, because we know that the drivers of violent extremism, there's no one-size-fits-all model. That the drivers are local, that even in one country, what goes on in a capital is different from the region. So that is the second area. With time is short, let me move very quickly to the three other areas. The third is putting a human face to counterterrorism. The respect for human rights. We heard the debate about the tension between security and human rights. But let me submit that the absolute fundamental importance of upholding human rights in the fight against terrorism. Because today, increasingly, governments are questioning that fundamental logic in the name of security, and more we are resorting to military-based approaches. Well, let me underline again that there is no military solution to terrorism. Ultimately, it has to be a much more comprehensive approach. Fourth, youth. We have to engage youth in a much more positive way. They are not ticking time bombs. They are majority a positive asset. There is a revolution going on in youth today, and we need to engage them as a positive understand what is driving youth and build better youth-focused policies. Because today we have the largest demographic of youth ever in the history of mankind. And this poses a huge challenge for governments and for the United Nations. And finally, building a new architecture of multilateral cooperation that moves from rhetoric to reality. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has put forward a major proposal in that regard. He has presented a major report. The UN General Assembly has pronounced on that. We have taken a few modest steps, but it's not the United Nations that's going to do it. It's all of us coming together here in Herzliya and beyond. And we need to put wheels to the rhetoric of multilateral cooperation. We have to implement the resolutions. We have to implement the legislation, and we have to build new frontiers. But we have to do this in an inclusive way that impacts, because that is what we're looking for. Impact, not more resolutions, not more rhetoric, not more speeches such as the one that I've just done. Thank you very much indeed.